You were never meant to hear this. They built walls of silence, consecrated them with fear, and buried the key for 200 years. But some secrets have a heartbeat. Listen, can you feel it? It's the story of two children born in 1834 in the suffocating humidity of a Kentucky valley who were not children at all. They were mirrors. And what they reflected was a truth so monstrous it broke the laws of God, of science, and of the carefully constructed reality they sell you as your life. The official records call it a mystery. We know what it was. It was an audit. A reckoning conducted by instruments that looked like little girls, but carried the weight of something ancient and unforgiving. This isn't history. This is a warning. We begin with a man of God, Pastor William Phillips. Imagine him. A man built of straight lines and rigid certainties, his soul as starched as his collar. He believed in a universe of neat columns, sin and salvation, damnation and grace. When he arrived in the remote Appalachian settlement of Pine Hollow, he thought he was entering a sanctuary, a pocket of forgotten piety. He was wrong. Pine Hollow wasn't forgotten. It was quarantined. The air itself was different, heavy, still, carrying the scent of damp soil and something else. Something like old paper and buried metal. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. And into this coiled silence walked the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, a man whose face was a roadmap of storms endured, and his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel. They were 9 years old, identical but for the storm in one's eyes and the abyss in the others. They clung to their father not with the fear of children, but with the gravity of anchors holding a ship in a churning sea. Phillips noted in his private journal, discovered a century later sealed within a wall of his final home, that his first impression was not of holiness, but of contagion. He felt an irrational urge to bolt the church doors, to sanctify the ground. They walked upon, he wrote, it was as if they did not bring the word of God, but a verdict long overdue. That first night, as they shared a meal, the quiet one, Rachel, looked at Philip's wife, her eyes holding no warmth, and said, "The lullaby you hum when you think you're alone. It was your mother's, wasn't it? The one she sang the night the fever took her." Mrs. Phillips froze, her hand trembling, the spoon falling from her grasp with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness. No one in Pine Hollow knew that story. Phillips had never even heard the lullaby himself. He had only seen its ghost in the hollows of his wife's eyes on lonely nights. In that moment, Pastor Phillips felt the first hairline crack form in the bedrock of his world. He didn't know it yet, but the twins were not there to save his flock. They were there to count the dead. The character you must become, to understand this, is Pastor Phillips. Feel his world tilting. The next morning, he was determined to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for the child's impossible knowledge. He was a man of reason, of scripture. He sought refuge in the familiar architecture of his faith. He found Ezekiel Morrison. By the cold hearth, staring into the embers as if reading a language of ash and decay. "Your daughters," Phillips began, his voice tight, "they are perceptive." Ezekiel turned, and in his eyes Phillips saw not a father's pride, but the profound, soul-deep wariness of a warden. "Perceptive is the word you use for a clever dog, Pastor," Ezekiel said, his voice low and raspy. "What they are is resonant. They vibrate with the frequency of things that have been buried. Things that were meant to stay buried." Before Phillips could process this, Rebecca, the more talkative twin, appeared in the doorway. She didn't look at Phillips, but through him. "Pastor," she said, her voice clear and without inflection, like a bell tolling under water. "You have a secret. A question you've asked God every night for 7 years, but you are too afraid of the answer to speak it aloud. Phillips felt his blood run cold. It was true. A secret doubt, a worm of heresy that gnawed at the root of his soul, the fear that his deceased firstborn son, who had died unbaptized, was eternally damned. It was a terror he had never confessed to another living soul, not even his wife. It was a stain of fear known only to him and his God. Rachel materialized beside her sister, a shadow given form. "He doesn't hear you," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "He can't. The ground here is sour. The prayers don't leave the soil." The statement was not a theological debate. It was a declaration of fact, delivered with the casual certainty of a farmer discussing the weather. It struck Phillips with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just exposed his secret shame. They had nullified his most sacred connection, the very foundation of his identity. They had reached into his soul and unplugged him from heaven. The rigid columns of his world began to buckle. He had two choices: shatter his own faith by believing them, or label to children as demonic too. Preserve the world he knew. What would you choose, a comforting lie or a terrifying truth? The first public service was a dissection. Ezekiel preached a sermon of fire and brimstone, his words painting vivid tapestries of hellfire, but it was a feint, a distraction. The true sermon began after the final amen. The congregation, 200 souls, bound by blood, marriage, and shared silence, began to file out. But the twins did not move. They stood before the altar, small and still, and began to speak. They did not shout, they did not accuse, they simply stated. Rebecca's gaze fell upon Samuel Turner, a pillar of the community, a man whose generosity was legendary. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice echoing in the suddenly silent church. "The deed to your land. The one you keep in the iron box. The ink is faded, but the original owner's name is still visible if you hold it to the light. His name was Silas Blackwood. He disappeared on the Cumberland Trail in 1821. His wife and 4 children waited for a year before they starved." Turner's face went the color of tallow. The story was known, but only in whispers, dismissed as tragic wilderness fate. Rebecca's statement wasn't an accusation. It was a ledger entry. Then Rachel turned to the town's midwife, the elderly. Martha Whitfield, a woman revered for her piety and gentle hands. "Mrs. Whitfield," she whispered, yet the whisper carried to every corner. "You tell the mothers their stillborn babies are angels in heaven. But you remember the one born with the father's eyes, the one you smothered with a pillow because its existence would have exposed the mother's affair with her husband's brother. You buried it in the unconsecrated earth behind the smokehouse. Sometimes, at night, do you still feel the weight of that pillow in your hands?" A low moan escaped Martha's lips. She swayed, her face a mask of primal horror. One by one, they moved through the crowd, not as children, but as auditors, reading from an invisible scroll of damnation. They spoke of stolen water rights, of a hidden attic room where a family concealed their imbecile son, of usurious loans that had driven men to suicide, of adulteries and betrayals that formed the very mortar of Pine Hollow's society. They revealed the rotten pilings beneath, the community's pristine facade. Each revelation was delivered with a chilling, surgical precision, devoid of emotion, like a doctor reading a terminal diagnosis. They weren't exposing sin for the purpose of redemption. They were performing an inventory of the rot. And Pastor Phillips watched, paralyzed, as his flock was not shepherded, but flayed. Their sins peeled back layer by layer, revealing the corrupted flesh beneath. The true target was not the sins of individuals. It was the system that nurtured them. The deepest secret of Pine Hollow was the story of the Whitman family, a tragedy that had become a local folk tale, a cautionary tale of a house fire in the winter of 1818, a lie. After the horrifying public audit, Rebecca walked to the front of the church and placed her small hand on the altar's rough-hewn wood. "This place is a tomb," she announced, her voice resonating with an authority that defied her age. The Whitman family didn't die in a fire. They were brought here for judgment. An old man, Elder Thompson, one of the founding fathers, rose unsteadily. "You speak blasphemy, child." Rachel's gaze locked onto him. Hope Whitman wore a silver locket with her mother's hair. Faith had a small wooden doll her father carved. When they died, Hope's locket was torn from her neck. The doll was crushed under a boot. "Your boot, Mr. Thompson." The details were too specific, too intimate. A wave of panicked murmurs swept the room. These weren't public records. They were the final, terrified moments of a dying family. The official narrative was a carefully constructed lie designed to preserve order. The Whitmans hadn't just been murdered. They had been erased. Jacob Whitman, the town blacksmith, had discovered the source of Pine Hollow's unnatural prosperity, a systematic enterprise of robbing and murdering travelers on the mountain pass. He wasn't a hero seeking justice. He was a partner who wanted a larger share. When the other founding fathers refused, he threatened exposure. His sin wasn't righteousness. It was greed that broke the code of silence. They weren't killed for being good. They were killed for being bad at being evil. They were a business deal gone wrong. The community, led by Thompson and the others, had judged and executed the entire family inside the very building meant to be their sanctuary. They were silenced not for their virtue, but because their truth was an inconvenience to the system. Have you ever been told your truth was disruptive? That your pain was an inconvenience to the comfort of others? Tell us, in the comments, if you know what it feels like to be silenced. Because what happened to the Whitmans is a ritual that repeats itself every day, in offices, in families, in places of power. Whenever a single voice threatens the profitable silence of the many, the children's purpose was becoming terrifyingly clear. They were not instruments of God's grace. They were agents of a different power, something that fed on the truth like a carrion bird. That night, Phillips, his faith in ruins, his mind reeling, tore his own church apart. Guided by a cold dread, he pried up the floorboards near the altar, the exact spot Rebecca had indicated. He expected to find bones, proof of the Whitman massacre. He found something far worse. It wasn't a mass grave. It was a vault. Beneath the packed earth was a stone-lined cavity, and inside, a heavy, lined box. The air that escaped when he opened it smelled of iron and ozone and time itself. It did not contain the bones of the Whitmans. It contained ledgers. Dozens of them, bound in human skin. The first page of the oldest ledger, dated 1818, was not a confession. It was a contract. A pact. It detailed a covenant, not with God, but with a silent, observing entity. The price of Pine Hollow's prosperity, its immunity from drought, from plague, from the hardships that ravaged other settlements, was sacrifice. Not of animals, but of secrets. The community was required to maintain a perfect, unbroken facade of piety and order. But beneath it, they were allowed, even encouraged, to indulge in the darkest aspects of human nature: greed, lust, betrayals. Long as it was all kept silent, the travelers murdered on the pass were not just for money. They were offerings. Their lives, their stories, their futures all fed to the entity that kept the valley unnaturally green. Pine Hollow was a human farm, a terrarium for the cultivation of hypocrisy. And its harvest was the psychic energy of secrets, the exquisite tension between the pristine surface and the rotting core. The Whitmans weren't killed for threatening to expose the murders, they were killed for threatening to upset the balance, to break the hermetic seal of silence that the pact demanded. They had threatened the harvest. The twins were the auditors. The contract stipulated that every few generations, messengers would arrive to test the integrity of the seal, to measure the psychic weight of the secrets, to ensure the pact was being upheld. They were a quality control mechanism. Ezekiel Morrison was not their father in any conventional sense. He was their handler. His journal, which Phillips would later find, was not a record of sermons, but of data. He described the twins' abilities in cold, clinical terms. Subject R's resonance is most effective on guilt-based trauma. Subject B excels at excavating legacy secrets passed through bloodlines. Emotional contagion levels in the congregation reached 78% during the audit of the Whitfield subject. He wasn't a preacher traveling a circuit. He was a scientist, or a priest of this dark faith, moving his instruments from one quarantined community to another, ensuring the experiments were running correctly. Pine Hollow was not unique. It was one of many such preserves scattered across the forgotten hollows and dark corners of the land. This was a system of control, ancient and vast, that used human communities as batteries, feeding on their duplicity. The twins were not there to bring justice for the dead. They were there to prune the rot, to identify the weak points in the system, the individuals whose guilt was becoming too loud, whose secrets were beginning to leak, threatening the integrity of the container. Elder Thompson's tearful confession wasn't a moment of redemption. It was a catastrophic system failure. He had broken the first and only commandment, "Thou shalt not speak." His emotional outburst was a crack in the dam, a leak of precious energy that the silent, observing entity could not tolerate. The twins looked at him not with pity, but with the cold, analytical disappointment of an engineer watching a critical component fail. The very air in Pine Hollow had changed. It was electric now, buzzing with exposed nerves and shattered certainties. The silence was gone, replaced by a cacophony of whispered confessions and paranoid glances. The carefully constructed prison of shame had been breached, its walls demolished. And into this chaos, Pastor Phillips felt a new, terrifying clarity. His God was silent. His heaven was empty. But the power in this valley was undeniably real. It was in the unnatural green of the leaves, in the chilling intelligence in the twins' eyes, in the weight of the skin-bound ledger in his hands. He was standing on holy ground, but it was a different kind of holiness. The holiness of the abattoir, of the laboratory, of the perfectly functioning machine. This was not a world of morality, of good and evil. It was a world of systems, of energy, of function and dysfunction. And he, William Phillips, was now a variable in the equation. He could no longer be a shepherd. He had to become something else. He saw the townsfolk not as his flock, but as fellow specimens in a grand, horrifying experiment. Their piety was a lie, their sins were currency, and their silence was a sacrament. This entire reality was a stage, a performance for an unseen audience, and the twins were the critics. Comment. The roots run deeper in the comments. Say it twice, because this isn't about one town. It's about the foundation of the world you think you know. The institutions you trust, the histories you're taught, they are all pristine surfaces, hiding the rotten, necessary structures beneath. Comment. The roots run deeper, to acknowledge that you are ready to look beneath the floorboards of your own reality. The final phase of the audit began. It was no longer about exposing the past. It was about cleansing the present. The twins. Attention turned from the old guard to the fabric of the community itself. They began to speak of the future. Not prophecies, but projections. Inevitabilities. Rachel approached the young, handsome Thomas Brett, whose secret trysts with a married woman had been exposed. "The child she carries is yours," Rachel stated, her voice flat. "When it is born with your eyes, her husband will kill you both. He will use a hunting knife. It will happen by the creek during the harvest moon." She was not warning him. She was describing the outcome of a variable, the logical conclusion of a flawed equation. She was showing him the blueprint of his own destruction. Rebecca turned to the Miller family, who had hidden their simple-minded son. "When the winter is hard and the food is scarce," she said, "you will begin to see his share of the rations as a waste. The thought will take root. You will stop feeding him first. Then you will lock the attic door for good. The silence from above will be a relief." They moved through the families, describing futures born of their secret shames, their weaknesses, their fears. They were showing them how the rot within would inevitably consume them from the inside out. This was the true horror of their gift. It wasn't just seeing the past, it was understanding the mechanics of human failure with such perfect clarity that the future became a fixed point. They were demonstrating that free will was an illusion, a comforting story told to specimens who were, in reality, trapped in the inexorable logic of their own nature. Pastor Phillips watched, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He was witnessing the methodical dismantling of hope itself. The twins were not judging them. They were proving a thesis. The climax was not an arrest or a trial. Authority from the outside world, sheriffs, judges, was irrelevant here. This was an internal matter, a recalibration of the system. The community was gathered once more in the church, not by the summons of a pastor, but by a palpable, unspoken command. Elder Thompson and the other founders who had confessed were brought to the front. They were weak, their guilt having made them porous, leaking the precious energy of the pact. They were liabilities. Ezekiel Morrison finally stepped forward. No longer the weary preacher, but the chief operator. He opened one of the skin-bound ledgers. He did not read from it. He simply held it open, and the air grew thick, cold, and heavy with pressure. "The covenant has been compromised," he said, his voice no longer raspy but resonant, powerful. "The vessel is cracked. It must be repaired." The twins stood on either side of him, their eyes closed. They weren't speaking anymore. They were broadcasting. A low, subvocal hum began to fill the church, a frequency that vibrated not in the ears, but in the bones, in the teeth. It was the sound of pure, concentrated knowledge. Pastor Phillips felt the stories, the secrets, the fears of everyone in the room pour into his mind, not as words, but as raw, unfiltered emotional data. He felt Martha Whitfield's suffocating guilt, Samuel Turner's cold greed, the raw terror of the lovers, the festering resentment of the Millers. He felt the collective, screaming soul of Pine Hollow. It was an agony beyond comprehension, a torrent of psychic filth that threatened to drown him, to erase his very consciousness. He understood. This was the true power, not speaking secrets, but forcing you to feel them, to become them. It was a weapon of psychological annihilation. In the midst of this psychic storm, a choice was presented to Pastor Phillips. It came not as a voice, but as a silent understanding, a path opening in the chaos. He could resist. He could cling to his shattered faith, his obsolete morality, and be scoured clean by the torrent. His mind wiped, his identity erased, becoming another nameless, forgotten casualty. Or he could let go of the man he was, the man named William Phillips, and embrace the terrifying, beautiful logic of the system. He could understand that good and evil were childish words for balance and imbalance, for function and chaos. He could become part of the machine. He looked at Ezekiel, who watched him with an expression of clinical curiosity. He looked at the twins, no longer children but glowing conduits of terrible power. And he looked at the congregation, writhing in the silent agony of their own exposed truths. He saw the pact for what it was, a brutal but effective form of order in a meaningless universe. It created prosperity. It maintained stability. The price was high, but the alternative was the random, pointless suffering of the outside world. He was being offered a position, a role, the keeper of the new, repaired vessel. If you learned that your entire world, your safety, your purpose, your very reality was built on a necessary, monstrous evil, would you tear it down? Or would you learn to live in the shadow it casts? The cleansing was swift. Elder Thompson and the others who had spoken simply ceased. There was no violence, no visible act. The humming intensified, focused on them, and they just faded. Like a photograph left in the sun, their features blurred, their substance thinned, until there was nothing left but a faint shimmer in the air that quickly dissipated. They had not been killed. They had been redacted, deleted from the ledger. Their energy, the energy of their lives and their guilt, was reabsorbed into the system, patching the cracks they had created. The humming subsided. The pressure lifted. The surviving members of the congregation sat in stunned, hollow silence. They were not relieved. They were empty, scoured. They had been shown the true face of their God, and it was a machine of perfect, merciless efficiency. They understood the rules now. They understood the price of silence and the cost of breaking it. The community of Pine Hollow was not destroyed. It was reforged, harder and more perfect than before. The system had not been broken. It had been upgraded. The weak parts had been purged, and the remaining components were bound by a new, more profound terror. Ezekiel Morrison closed the ledger. His work was done. The audit was complete. He looked at Phillips, who stood trembling, not with fear, but with a terrible, ecstatic understanding. Ezekiel nodded once, a gesture of transfer. The wardenship was now his. Pastor William Phillips' final journal entry, written years later, in a hand that was barely recognizable, was not the writing of a pastor. It was the log of a custodian. "The vessel is stable," he wrote. "The harvest is abundant. The periodic tremors of guilt are managed with approved rituals of confession, which serve to reinforce the seal rather than weaken it. The new generation is strong, their understanding of the covenant intuitive, they do not question, they perform. The silence is perfect." He never left Pine Hollow. He became its heart, the central processor for the community's intricate web of secrets and lies. He guided them, not with scripture, but with the cold, unassailable logic of the pact. He ensured the performance was flawless, the facade impenetrable. He became a far more effective warden than Elder Thompson ever was, because he understood the system, not as a sin to be hidden, but as a sacred mechanism to be maintained. He had found his God. After all, it wasn't in the sky. It was in the silence. Between the floorboards, it was in the hum of the machine. The Morrison family left as quietly as they arrived. Their work in Pine Hollow was finished. But other valleys, other quarantined communities, awaited their audit. The experiment continued. The system is vast, and it is always hungry. It feeds on the difference between who you pretend to be and who you are in the dark. It is feeding. Right now, what of the twins? Rebecca and Rachel. They were not girls. They were a function. A diagnostic tool in a flesh-hand-blood shell. Did they grow up? Did they die? The question is meaningless. The system that created them simply reabsorbs its tools when they are no longer needed, and creates new ones when the time is right. Perhaps, somewhere, In another forgotten town, another set of twins has just arrived. Their eyes holding that same chilling emptiness, ready to begin the audit. Ready to measure the weight of the silence. They are the antibodies of a reality far older and stranger than our own. They are the reason some towns feel wrong, some silences feel loud, some history feels buried alive. They are the proof that the world is not what it seems. They are the keepers of a truth you were never meant to know, that your reality is a carefully managed performance. And the price of admission is a secret you must carry, unspoken, to your grave. The story of Pine Hollow is not over. It is happening all around you. The roots run deeper than you can ever imagine. This knowledge is now a part of you. It lives in the quiet rooms of your mind. You cannot unhear the turning of that key. You cannot unfeel the chill of that silence. The door has been opened. To continue the descent, to see what lies in the other sealed rooms of history. Subscribe to the sealed room. We've been waiting for you.